Candidate for a Coffin by T.W. Ford. Death stood on the Times Square subway platform, uptown side, waiting for a subject. Death looked at himself in the gum machine mirror, then down at his watch. It was exactly 4:12 p.m., Wednesday, December 10th. When the second hand hit the 30 mark, he would turn around, and the nearest person would be it. Death wore a blue pinstripe suit, well-fitting but slightly unpressed. Death's name was Wilson Lamb. The second hand swiped over the 20 of the smaller dial, jittered on towards the half-minute spot. Inexorable and meaningless, just as what Wilson Lamb planned. He said, "Now," with a little sucking in of breath and a thin anticipant smile, and spun on his heel. He was a slim, saturnine-faced man, with cigarette ash stain on a coat lapel, undistinguished from any typical strap hanger except perhaps by the light-hued eyes. His shoes needed a shine. He lifted the pale eyes from them and looked for the corpse to be. To the left, to the right. Then he came as near recoiling from the thing as he ever would. It looked as if it might be a woman. Somehow he had always thought of killing a man, something that could strike back. Not that he would get the chance. It was just the idea of the thing. But she, the woman, was descending the stairs that led up to the shuttle, bearing down toward him, less than 20 feet away. Big and billowy and red-faced, waddling along like a sow. To face a jury, charged with doing away with a hunk of human beef like that, and he flashed a glance to the left again. Nobody near. It was a fluke of circumstance. A score of people were buzzing all about him. He whipped his eyes back toward the woman as a local thundered in. And luck took a hand. A stocky man dodged around from behind the woman and came rapidly down the platform, neat, crisp briefcase under his arm. Wilson Lamb's pale eyes flickered with amusement. He said softly, "Tag, you're it, John W. Goon." This was his corpse to be. Mr. Death had made his pickup. "Excuse me." An express rolled in, and cutting over for it, the stocky man brushed Lamb. His voice was mild, colorless. He wore a gray snap-brim hat. It was set squarely on his head, precisely level. Lamb had seen hats worn like that by show window clothing dummies. The man entered the third car, middle door. Wilson Lamb boarded it on his heels. His victim almost got a seat. A pimply-faced office boy elbowed him out of it, and the man turned away meekly. He hooked himself onto a strap, hitched the briefcase up under his free arm, and concentrated on a segment of his folded-open newspaper. It was one of the conservative sheets, comicless, reactionary Republican to the core. Wilson eased down the aisle, casually pushed a woman out of his way, and glanced over his victim's shoulder. The goon was studying an advertisement for a 9-piece living room suite, overstuffed at special reduction this week only. It was one of the better department stores. Amusement flickered in Wilson Lamb's pale eyes. He got the picture. A typical George Babbitt in the flesh. To the core. At 72nd Street, the stocky man got a seat. When he faced a light, Lamb saw that he was turning slightly gray over the years. He had a roundish face, a little fleshy under the chin, a soft-lipped mouth that, from habit, he held slightly pursed, muddy eyes. He was inclined to plumpness. Somebody had scuffed his right shoe in getting out, and now he pulled up the pant leg of his dark gray suit to study it ruefully. Typical taxpayer, Lamb said to himself, savoring it. Always makes his insurance payments on time. Probably has weak arches. Is going to buy the 5-foot bookshelf, always next week, and read it. Would like to get up nerve enough to take that blonde steno at the office out to luncheon. Wilson Lamb wanted to laugh out loud. It was as good as having a duck flutter down smack in front of your blind. Past 86, the express roared. Lamb's victim had turned his paper, halved back the last page. Automatic pencil poised, he was scanning the crossword puzzle intently. As they lolled through 91st, he bared his teeth in a satisfied smile and rapidly filled in 4 vertical blanks, then filled out the lower right-hand corner. Lamb saw that his 4 upper front teeth were a neatly fitted denture. He wondered how they'd look after a bullet had gone through them. The victim got off at 96th, carefully straightening his muffler inside his black overcoat. He went downstairs, crossed beneath the local platform to the west side, and mounted to street level. He had a cigarette in his mouth, but waited until he was outside the subway entrance before he put a match to it. Lamb lit one too. He picked up an evening paper from the newsstand. It might come in handy if it got to close quarters with the dope, and he wanted to mask his face. The news dealer was looking the other way as he made change, so Lamb plucked back his nickel. The victim started to cross 96th Street, heading north. A traffic officer's whistle shrilled. Broadway was spattered with the ruby red of traffic lights. Vehicles moved cross town. Dutifully, Lamb's goon turned and retraced his steps to the curb, holding his 4-square hat carefully. A little trick with skimpy skirts wrapped about plump calves crossed on over. Watching her, Lamb's victim shook his head. Lamb could hear him saying, "Foolish to take chances like that." Imagine him saying it anyway. Lamb kept at a cautious distance as they moved several blocks up Broadway. Walking briskly, the victim turned into a side street. There was something smug about the way he picked up his heels and swung his briefcase. A little man who's had a busy day with a job well done. Lamb paraphrased it sarcastically. He pushed his battered felt hat further back on his head in a gesture of disgust. His cheap, unbuttoned raglan-style coat fluttered in the wind off the Hudson. Abruptly, the man ahead halted, wheeled. Lamb calmly turned and opened the rear door of a parked sedan whose driver was at the wheel. Put a foot in. Down the block, his victim headed into a distinctly second-rate apartment hotel. Lamb said to the sedan driver, "I thought this was a hearse," and went down the block. His victim was getting his mail at the desk when Lamb entered the shabby lobby. Lamb got on the elevator after him. The victim said 9, immersed in his paper again, studying that living room suite. He had his key ready in his hand. Terracotta-hued tab swinging loose. 914 was lettered on it in black. 10, bud, Lamb told the operator. On the 10th floor, he moved quickly down the frayed carpet of a corridor and found the service stairs. Back on the 9th, even when he was yards from the door of 914, he caught the odor of cooking, rich and greasy. He got his ear against the door. Spare ribs and sauerkraut, hide. The victim was calling out inside. Lamb could visualize him putting his coat on a hanger, carefully folding a scarf over it. From the rear of the apartment came Ede's voice, Reedian, with a bit of a whine. Lamb could visualize her, too, a dyed blonde who devoured film fan magazines and thought the girdle was the world's greatest invention. Uh-huh. How'd things go downtown today, Lou? Through the thin door, Lamb could hear him clear his throat and mutter, "Oh, so-so." But Ede wasn't to be put off. "Lou, did you tell the boss you have to have a raise? That the job is worth more?" Lou started to mumble something. Ede's voice, penetrating the door easily, rose to a querulous pitch. "Lou, you're too easygoing. You ain't got the sense to stand up for your rights. You're an expert in your line, you know it. There's never any kickback or complaint on a job you do." I know, Ede, but Wilson Lamb's victim got in. "You're entitled to more money, Lou. You've never bungled a job yet. I need a new coat. And you said you wanted to put the kid in a private school after the first of the year. How are we going to do it if you don't?" Lou said, "Look, Ede, something came up today, and the boss had to leave in a hurry, right in the middle of a conference. I just had time to grab my briefcase myself. Let's get to work on those spare ribs." They moved toward the rear of the apartment, and Lamb out in the hall could hear no more. He was chuckling as he walked away. Lou's mouth curled in a sneer. Back on the 10th floor, he boarded the elevator again. Again, it was empty except for the operator, a tow-headed kid with a racing form tucked in a side pocket. "Funny thing," Lamb mentioned casually. "I could have sworn I knew that man who rode up with me. Stocky chap. Got over the 9th. But I can't seem to recall his name." "Mr. Engel, you mean?" "Engel. Engel. Lou Engel? Is he an accountant?" "Yeah, Louis Engel's the name, but he ain't no accountant. Comes from Chicago. I heard him tell the manager he was an efficiency expert." Lamb stopped rattling the coins in his pocket suggestively, kept them there, and strolled toward the main entrance. Behind him, a lobby lounger moved over to the elevator boy, jerking his chin in Wilson Lamb's direction as he asked a question. At the corner, Lamb stopped in and bought a drink. Thin face creased in a smile of self-satisfaction, he glanced at the paper he'd bought. Below the latest war communiques was a small column head about a threatened gang war in the numbers racket. "Police raid Joe, the Flasher, Abadiro's headquarters," it said. Lamb's eyes picked up flashes of it. When plainclothes squad walked into luxurious apartment, Midtown West Side Hotel, several henchmen taken into custody on technical charges, Abadiro reported out of town. Police acting on tip killers imported from Chicago. Showdown anticipated on who will boss numbers racket in metropolitan area. Lamb turned the paper over and winked at himself in the concave mirror of the semicircle of bar. That was unimportant claptrap to somebody like him. That kind of tripe was for the little Joe dopes who got their thrills vicariously. There was going to be nothing vicarious about what he was going to do. He was going to rub out Louis Engel. Blast him. Louis the Goon, as he'd already christened him in his mind. He'd put the finger on him. Louis the Goon is going to die, Wilson Lamb said softly. He liked the sound of it. He wasn't crazy. Long ago, he'd assured himself of that. It was just that his mind operated on a different, a higher plane than the norm. He wasn't one of the little pieces of protoplasm running along with the herd. He was above them, looking down on them, studying them. His perspective ranged somewhat further than the end of his nose, the latest double feature at the neighborhood movie house, and spare ribs. That last made him laugh out loud. He picked up his change and headed back for the subway and his 2-room apartment in the village. His gun, a .45 automatic, was there. He would be needing it soon. Louis the Goon practically demanded, invited, the use of a .45 automatic on him. Efficiency engineer, Lamb said to himself once. The guy was the perfect subject, ripe for murder. The more Lamb thought of it, the more he was convinced he couldn't have dreamed up a better stooge. Engel was a model for homicide. He himself might die for it. But that was unimportant. The killing of Louis the Goon was the only thing that counted. The results, materially speaking, meant nothing. This slaying was to be an exposition of the ego, without other cause, emotionless, with no hope of gain, financial or otherwise. No female involved. Nothing. Just a killing. A plain, open and shut case of homicide, for no earthly reason imaginable to the police. It would be amusing to watch those flatfoots sitting around trying to sift a motive out of the thing. Baby, they'd sweat their so-and-sos off trying to cook up a reason for this one. It was so simple to Lamb himself. Inevitable. A logical step in a sequence. The final step, perhaps. Louis the Goon Engel was a mere walk-on in the piece. A spear carrier doomed to death. Little better than a papier-mâché dummy set up to be a target for the custard pie. Only in this case, the custard pie was to be a Cupro steel-nosed bullet. To Lamb, it boiled down to an ultimate expression of the psyche, the final test of one's ability to project the personal ego over all else in the material world. Because the ego was the alpha and omega of all living. The moment one got above the level of animal existence, the mere feeding of the face and satisfaction of the other instinctive physical hungers, As Bronich put it so succinctly, even the lowest worm can procreate itself. Unfortunately. Then, of course, there was Nietzsche and his Superman, and some of Freud, and that treatise of Van der Water, the Belgian, on the sublimation of the subconscious by the negation of the self-censor, and the papers of Brolinsky in the Old University of Warsaw on the fear trauma, which he termed a birthmark of civilization. Lamb had gone into all of them, deeply, all of them dealing with the ego and its development and complete consummation. And the killing of Louis the Goon Engel was going to be the consummation of Wilson Lamb's experiments in the total exemplification of that ego. It was no brash idea, no harebrained impulse concocted in one's cups, perhaps. Analytically, objectively, he'd thought out the whole thing. The axis of life was the psyche. Its two poles were birth and death. And, as Bronich had stated, the former was a function, often accidental, of which the lowest animal order was capable. A monocell, the amoeba, was able to reproduce itself by the simple stratagem of subdivision. But death, when it became a deliberate action, administered without emotion or hope of material gain, was one step removed from the Godhead. Perhaps less than one step. But the step that would raise one above all the little fumbling, blind, spawning, life-hugging bipeds who infested the scene. In short, birth was fortuitous, a product of circumstance plus proximity. It's a biological accident. But death, the taking of life, was a selective process, intentionally executed, the result of a foreseen conclusion. In so doing, the taking of life, you broke the greatest law of humanity, and so became above it. You unfettered the ego with a single, ineradicable stroke. In taking a life, one tasted the essence of living. He tried to remember who had said that. De Maupassant put it better, but Lamb could not quite recall the quotation. He was still trying to remember it as he lounged down the block from Engel's apartment hotel at 8:10 the next morning. There was a bone-chilling breeze off the drive that made Lamb belt his coat tighter about him. When, at 9:35, Louis the Goon Engel had not made an appearance, Lamb went down to the corner drugstore and had a cup of coffee. He could not see the entrance of the hotel through the window, but he commanded a clear view of the street and anybody coming up toward the subway. And if he ever saw one, his corpse-to-be was a methodical little piece of humanity. He would come and go to the subway by the same route. Wilson Lamb was correct, as he had never doubted. But it was 11:07 by his wristwatch before Engel emerged. The gray hat just as squarely set on his head as before. Without a glance around, Engel came out of the hotel and turned his steps dutifully in the direction of the subway. Lamb was strolling on the other side of the street at the moment. On sight of him, he turned up the front stairs of a brownstone. But a few seconds later, his long legs were carrying him rapidly toward Broadway. By hustling, he got to the other side of it, entered the subway on the uptown side, crossed underneath, and was waiting in the bypass when Engel came along. Engel trotted up to the downtown express platform. When the next train pulled out, Lamb was in the vestibule, half a car length away from him. Taking the trouble to keep at a distance, to make himself inconspicuous, seemed almost wasted effort. Louis the Goon went along, looking neither to left nor right, docilely intent on minding his own business. Efficiency expert, Lamb said to himself. Bet he's a crackerjack at cutting down on the overhead. It was like playing a game of cat and mouse with him, Wilson Lamb the cat. Only in this instance, the mouse seemed as good as blind. Lamb could have given it to him at any time, a slug in the back that would terminate his little life the way you would step on a cockroach. On second thought, he would not give it to him in the back. It would be the front, so he could see the stricken, stupid look of surprise. He'd probably try to get his foolish little briefcase in front of him like a shield. Lamb could just see it, hear his squeal of futile protest too. Yes, he could give it to him whenever he chose. Just walk up to him and squeeze the trigger and savor omnipotence for a moment. Very simple. At his leisure. But Wilson Lamb wasn't going to do it that way. That would have been like a blind stab in the dark, meaningless, impersonal. Like taking a hack at a piece of meat or tossing a bomb into a crowd. Instead, he wanted to know something about his specimen before he exterminated him. Understand his background. Get a fair picture of the little sphere of the life from which he was unknowingly about to depart. Bland didn't figure to take long in the case of Louis the Goon. What Engel was Putty Patton, a typical little taxpayer, careful to keep his nose clean, asking only to be permitted to tread his narrow path unmolested. Undoubtedly the type who got sick to his stomach at the sight of blood, even though it might be no more than a nosebleed. At 42nd Street, Louis the Goon got off and trundled over to the shuttle. He passed through the Grand Central Station, stopping off to buy a package of Camels en route. The cigar store had a counter display of a bargain buy of razor blades, combined with some unknown brand of shaving cream. Engel hovered over it like a bargain-hunting housewife. The cleric put on the spiel. Engel bought, got stuck for a bottle of aftershave lotion too. Lamb saw it all from over by the counter of the baggage-checking room. A penny saved is a penny earned. He paraphrased for him. They cut through the Gray Bar building to come out on Lexington. Engel proceeded north a few blocks, turned into one of the commercial hotels noted for its name band. Halfway across the lobby, a tall, swarthy man with one of those deadpan faces rose to greet him. They shook hands. "You're right on the dot," the tall man said. Engel's pursed mouth lengthened in a flattered smile. "I always make it a point to be punctual," Lamb, dawdling in the background, overheard him say. Then they headed for the elevator bank. The tall one shot 2 glances backward as they did so. Lamb couldn't make it too obvious. When he rounded the corner of the L where the elevators were, they were gone. Lamb went back into the main lobby and ensconced himself behind the morning paper. Midway down the page was more about the threatened strife in the numbers racket. It didn't interest Lamb in the slightest. Engel had probably gone upstairs to try and peddle one of his efficiency schemes to some big shot. The guy he'd met in the lobby was a go-between, doubtlessly. Lamb wondered whether Louis the Goon would get up the nerve to hit his boss for that raise today, as Ede had demanded. Lamb almost lost him. Half an hour later, Louis the Goon came down and scooted out the side entrance in a hurry. When Lamb got out there, his man was already in a cab shooting away. There was something wrong about the conservative, penny-saving Engel taking a taxi. Wilson Lamb did not realize it at the time. They went westward across town. Over near 6th, Lamb's driver lost the other cab. Lamb was cursing when he spotted Engel on the sidewalk, coming back across town. That was strange because he could have sworn Engel's cab had not stopped. Must have got him mixed up with another. Out, he threaded his way recklessly through a welter of vehicles and picked up the tail as his man entered an office building. It was fairly crowded in that foyer, and it was simple to step into the elevator at Louis the Goon Engel's back, then wheel behind him out of sight as he turned. Engel called 14 and got out there, briefcase tightly clutched up under his arm, its flap unbuckled. Going into high pressure, somebody on a sale, Lamb figured. Another passenger had called 15th, the next floor. Lamb got out there, found the built-in fire escape, and got down to 14. This was a little foolish, he realized. There was no way of finding what office Louis the Goon had visited. Still, he might see him when he came out. Maybe he'd gone to see the boss about that raise Ede was demanding. Maybe he'd come out bouncing on his tail feathers. It was fun, following and watching Louis the Goon. Like watching an ant on a sidewalk flagstone, pottering about its puny business, knowing you were going to stamp out its life when it so pleased you. Lamb was just lighting a cigarette, gazing down the hallway of the 14th floor, when the muffled report came up the staircase. It didn't seem possible. A gun seemed so out of place in such surroundings. Then, there were 2 more shots, a scream intermixed. The shattering of plate glass. Lamb was down the stairs and pulling open the fire door onto the floor below. Immediately he sniffed the acrid fumes of gunpowder. He was looking out onto an L of that floor, onto a tableau of violence. There was just a single office suite on that L, directly opposite him. On one of its double doors was lettered, Continental Exhibition Corp. The frosted glass of the other door was almost completely broken out, leaving a jagged fringed aperture to which to view the scene within. Wilson Lamb flattered himself on being pretty cool-headed under all circumstances, but he blinked 3 times rapidly now. Inside the Continental Exhibition Corporation, one man was slumped over a desk, an automatic half-gripped in his inert hand. He was very dead. Half his head was shot off. Another man was sprawled in the grey broadloom of the reception room, a brownish puddle beneath his side. He wasn't going to be going any place in a hurry either. Even as Lamb stared at the carnage, a third figure appeared, wobbling drunkenly from an inner office. He came, stooped over, holding his side, crimson-speckled froth at his lips. He got to the shattered glass panel and moved the lips at Wilson Lamb. "Tell him the police. It was Whisper Ross from He coughed twice on the Chicago, then caved in on himself and went flat in the hallway. Lamb saw an ashen-faced, bespectacled man peering around the corner of an L. From further back, through an open doorway, a girl's voice was shrieking for the police over the phone. Lamb remembered the fact that he had a gun on his person. It might be extremely embarrassing if the police picked him up for questioning. Ducking back through the fire door, he ran quickly up to the 16th floor, up past the 15th. Nothing had been heard up there yet. He caught a down car and got out just as the first prowl car came sirening its way into the side street curb. Afterward, outside the police cordon thrown around the building, somebody jostled against him, peered under his hat brim. Later, Lamb recalled the bluish scar crescent on his left cheek. "Hey, aren't you Reynolds of the Dispatch, pal?" "Nope," Lamb said. "You're a reporter with one of the local sheets, aren't you?" The other persisted. I know I've seen you around before." "You must have been wearing your other glasses, bud," Lamb said, and turned away. Maybe it was the effect of seeing the handiwork of that other unknown killer, for the police had nabbed nobody yet in that midtown midday shooting. Anyway, Lamb had the itch to strike. It was like a thirst building in a guy. You've seen somebody else dip into a tall, cool one, and after a while, you feel like you've got to have one yourself. Those 3 dead men on the 13th floor of that office building had acted like an aphrodisiac on Wilson Lamb. He wanted to get him his corpse, but soon. He knew it when he picked up his victim again. It was almost 4 p.m., shreds of snow drifting down through New York's early darkness. He was hanging around by the cab stand above 96th on the west side of Broadway, waiting, hopefully. He'd got so that he felt a little lonely when he didn't have Louis the Goon right handy. He felt on familiar terms with the guy. Of course, Louis the Goon didn't know him. And when he introduced himself, Louis was going to get one hell of a big surprise. Like a kick in the teeth, only a lot more permanent. One of the hackies turned up his radio. A news commentator was on. He came to the topic of the Midtown shooting. 3 dead, gunned down in the office of the Continental Exhibition Corporation. Lamb edged over nearer. The Continental outfit, the announcer said, was the business front of one Big John Guerra, well-known local racketeer. Guerra was a powerful figure in the Metropolitan Pinball Game Syndicate, and had a piece of the number policy racket, too. Police, promising an arrest within 24 hours, claimed the triple killing a step in the fight for control of the numbers game business in this city. They are still seeking the missing Joe the Flasher Abadiro, also reputed to have boasted that he would take over the numbers game. 2 of the slain men have been identified as close associates of Big John Gira. A building employee stated earlier today that Gira left the premises less than 5 minutes before the killing. A prominent police official who refused to be quoted asserted the killer was a Chicago torpedo imported for the job, a killer who would not be recognized by members of the New York mobs. "We are closing in on him at this very instant," the official concluded. The news broadcaster went on to another item of the day's reports. Lamb turned around, and there was Louis the Goon Engel, not 4 feet away. En route home from the subway, he'd paused to listen to the report too. He stood now with a calculating look, almost as if he were checking the verity of the report. Lamb wanted to laugh in his face. "If you'd seen those 3 carcasses leaking blood all over the place, you'd probably have swooned in your britches, my little doke." Lamb addressed him mentally. And the funny part was, the little dope had been so close to it. Just a floor away, in fact. As he followed him on uptown, down his side street, Lamb had a curious sense of elation. He was in on the ground floor of Death, Inc., even before voting at a stockholders' meeting himself. For he knew who had triggered those 3 today. Who the shy torpedo the cops wanted was one Whisper Ross. Of course, he might have tipped off the police, say, by a phone call, but he wasn't going to. We killers must stick together. The thought tickled his sense of humor. They were almost at Louis the Goon's roost when Lamb saw how he was going to do it. A boy with a carton of groceries almost ran down Louis, then ducked down into the delivery entrance of the apartment hotel. And Wilson Lamb had his cue. Some 10 minutes later, after due investigation, he knew how he was going to put Louis the Goon on the spot. And how he was going to get away with it. Get clear afterward. The taking of life was the important thing. The major premise. Whether he was caught or not had never seemed important before. But after reviewing the handiwork of Whisper Ross, who had ambled off unimpeded, Lamb saw no reason why he should not do the same. It would be the nth degree in the epitomization of the ego to kill and get away with it. The building's delivery entrance was a perfect avenue of escape. Actually, it did not enter the hotel at first. Down a few steps, and then it ran rearward, between the side of the building and the retaining wall next door. An open-topped alleyway. The delivery doorway was in the rear. A few feet further on was the backyard, laid out in a garden with a waterless, age-browned concrete fountain in the center. A low concrete wall separated it from the property that backed onto it. And there was the payoff. Ambling casually through in the darkness, Lamb had discovered that the property in the rear, facing on the next street downtown, was several feet lower. It would be simple to drop over the wall to its paved courtyard, and from that ran a concrete passage beside the apartment house out on the street 1 block below. Emerging on it, Lamb lit a cigarette and went back around the block to Engel's place. He appraised it like a surveyor. First off, it was one of those second-rate places that boasted no doorman. Across the street were those brownstones, for a nice dim background. The nearest street lamp was down about 10 feet from the entrance of Engel's place. Engel would come walking along primly, right into its light. A man crossing the street from the brownstones, a little behind Engel, calling out, "Hey, Mr. Engel," and it was a very nice setup. The property line of the building where Engel lived was set back several feet further than that of the old-fashioned private homes between it and Broadway. They would serve as a screen for his movements from one direction. When he hit into that delivery alleyway, after fixing Louis the Goon's wagon once and for all, Lamb realized it was almost ridiculously simple. Why? He could have almost chalked an X right there and then on the sidewalk, where little Louis would lie down and forget it all. Wilson Lamb hummed as he headed up toward Broadway and decided to have dinner. He had a swell appetite. He was humming snatches from something. Minor key, descending scale. It went, "Come to Papa, come to Papa, come to Papa." He didn't know whether it was from a song or a crap game. Anyway, the dice were sure loaded against a certain party he knew. Down the block, a taxi that had been parked with meter ticking across from Engel's apartment hotel drew away slowly. He went to the movies with Louis the Goon that evening. Louis didn't know anything about it, and Lamb bought his own ticket. That, too, had been extremely simple. After dinner, he'd phoned Engel. When Louis himself answered, Lamb had asked for toots. Louis said they had no toots there. And Lamb had said he was very sorry, that he must have got the wrong number. And Louis said that was all right, no harm done. And Lamb said he was sorry he'd disturbed him, and Louis said to think nothing of it, no trouble at all. And Lamb said a 4-letter word after he'd hung up and laughed out loud in the phone booth. Then he hung around and saw Louis come out after dinner. Ede was with him this time. Ede was the type after which some department store advertising department diplomat had coined the term stylish stout. Ede toddled, and she was pretty hefty. If there was a family argument, Lamb would have laid 2-1 she would have come home in front by a TKO before the 5th round. They went into the movies on the northwest corner of 96th. The closest Lamb could get was some 3 rows back. He was disappointed because he could not watch Engel's face. It was a double feature. Pampas Nights was one of those alleged South American musicals whipped up by a couple of sub-morons with the intent purpose of sabotaging the good neighbor policy. The other picture was some ghoulish thing about a mad surgeon, described in the script as an egomaniac, who had a pleasant pastime of revivifying electrocuted felons. That one gave Lamb a pain in the pants, too. He'd really made a study of egomaniacs. He got out in the foyer right behind the Engels. He heard Ede say she thought the one about that natty doc was so thrilling. Louis the Goon did not agree. He liked those musicals. They take my mind off business, he said. Lamb left them and went in and had a drink. He had 2 drinks. Now that everything was settled, he felt no impatience. It was all lined up, right down to the final curtain. Lewis's final curtain. Lamb had already decided that he would give it to him as he was plodding his smug little way home some evening. Any evening. Maybe tomorrow evening. Now that the details were ironed out, it was fun to leave the closing date open. He could play the fly on the wall in Louis the Goon's life as long as he wanted. And when he got bored with Lewis's act, bop, he would deliver his compact little package to Louis. He started to get bored fast the next day. He rode downtown with Louis and they went over to the same East Side hotel, and Louis went upstairs. He was gone a long time. Lamb said to himself, "That dope goes around in a rut, and I'll get in one too just following him, and then I will get sore." Eventually, Louis the Goon came back down into the lobby. The tall, swarthy man he had met there the day before was with him. "Well, I guess there'll be nothing doing today," Louis the Goon said. "Nope, nothing," the other said. They parted. Louis went down to the telephones and used one after consulting a little black book. When he came out, he bought a white carnation for his buttonhole in the florist shop, and then treated himself to 3 25-center perfectos. Something builds, Lamb told himself. Outside, when Louis the Goon got in a taxi, there was something positively cocky about him. Lamb was humming his "Come to Papa" again, as he took another and trailed him eastward this time. Louis got out at a 3rd Avenue bar and grill and went in. Lamb gave him 5 minutes and straight in himself. There was no Louis. Not at first, anyway. Lamb could feel his pulse beat faster. Then he spotted the dim back room with the booths, and he went through it to the men's room. And there was Louis the Goon, his little clay pigeon, in one of the booths with a doll. She was red-haired by courtesy of the local beauty parlor, cuddling up in a flashy little leopard fur number. She looked like a dance hall hostess from one of those joints where everything goes, so long as you keep time to the music. As Lamb passed, she was saying, "Now, Daddy." That almost unbuttoned Lamb. Daddy. On his way back, he noticed there were 2 others in the back room, a couple of men gnawing on pretzels over beers. He stepped back into the bar just in time. 3 men had entered. They headed straight for the rear. One of them shouldered Wilson Lamb from his path as if he didn't see him. The second one pulled out a cannon and poked it at the bartender and told him to keep his britches on. Then the other 2 were in the rear and letting go with their cannon. Slammed over against the bar, Lamb had a split-second glimpse of it. For a moment, it almost seemed as if the damn fools were after Engel. One shot smashed the table lamp in the booth where he sat. Then the 2 beer drinkers back in there were around and swapping it out with cannon of their own with the newcomers. Lamb got out of there fast. He got across the street. He saw 2 men dash out of a side entrance into a dark sedan that roared away. He did not see Louis the Goon get out. Then the howling prowl cars converged on the scene. And there was an ambulance. It took one guy away. Another guy, it didn't. Lamb worked his way up into the throng and got a glimpse of the other guy getting stiff on the backroom floor. Everybody else was lined up in the bar for questioning. Engel was not among them. So Lamb knew he must have gotten away all right. "This is some more of that numbers racket war," a gray-haired sergeant said. And then Lamb began to taste something like panic, even as the first neon signs began to smear the wintry shadows. He got afraid that he might lose his little clay pigeon. Louis the Goon seemed to have a blind genius for getting on the scene when some bloodletting was due. He felt a certain possessiveness towards Louis. Louis belonged to him, and he wasn't going to have him chopped down by any piece of stray lead. Lamb had a bullet earmarked for Louis. He said, "I've been wasting time." He got on the shuttle and over the west side and up to 96th and across the street from where Louis lived. Well, where Louis used to live, anyway. He was there just 20 minutes. It was 4:43 by his wristwatch when Louis the Goon came down from the corner. He couldn't make out his face at first, but knew him by that square-set hat. Lamb eased away from the stairs of the brownstone, humming, "Come to Papa, come to Papa, come to Papa." This was it. The ultimate in the demonstration of the ego. He told himself that as he moved over the scabrous snow of the street. The zenith in the projection of the psyche. Louis the Goon had his briefcase clutched up under one arm instead of swinging. The final triumph over the fear trauma. Louis was abreast of him, then passing by. Wilson Lamb brought the automatic out from under his coat. He called, "Mr. Engel?" And Louis the Goon turned, and Lamb held it, wanting him to get a good look at the heater, wanting to get a good look at him as he saw it. Engel had the briefcase open, unbuckled. He was bringing something out of it swiftly, jerkily. It was a heater, too. That wasn't in the script. Louis the Goon was stepping out of role. But Lamb knew he had him anyway and started to squeeze. He would squeeze 3 times on that trigger and somebody else squeezed first. It was the man running from that parked car down the street. Lamb got it in the side, and then a red-hot finger was probing down into his guts. A man stepped from the vestibule of one of those brownstones, and he squeezed, and Wilson Lamb couldn't feel a side of his head anymore. Knew he would never feel it again. He was down on one hand and one knee, and his gun was gone. Someplace in the black haze seething around him. Like a hurt animal, half crawling, knowing only the base instinct of self-preservation, he tried for that delivery alleyway. Somebody else had figured that was a good spot, too. It was the man with the bluish cheek scar who had accosted him after the triple killing in that office building. He squeezed, and Lamb took one square in the chest. In a vague way, as the sidewalk slid up at him, he was aware of that car backfiring away like hell. The man with the blue scar was standing over him, throwing words to Louis the Goon in a quick, harsh whisper. "This is the one, Whisper. He's coming here with you Wednesday. He was on the spot when you give it to them boys in Gira's office yesterday. Today, he was in that bar when they tried to get you. The flasher said stay close to you. And him." "Gira's fingerman, eh?" called back Engel softly. "Yeah, Whisper." The blue-scarred man ran. In a moment, a car roared off down the block toward West End Avenue. Lying there on the sidewalk, blasted for keeps, his wagon fixed, Wilson Lamb tried to put it together. Things moved very slowly for him. Whisper. Whisper Ross. Chai Torpedo. And then he had it. Whisper Ross was Louis the Goon Engel, hired killer of Joe the Flasher Abadiro. The guy he, Wilson Lamb, had fingered for an exposition of his ego. Down the sidewalk, little Mr. Louis Engel, alias Whisper Ross, stood looking at the body and going, through pursed lips, Wilson Lamb's ego died a horrible death 17 seconds before he did. So that was a Pope story by T.W. Ford, who was a prolific writer of westerns and all sorts of other Pope stuff. It was called A Candidate for a Coffin. And it was narrated by Caspar Stockhausen, who has done other stuff for us on the Classic Detective channel. Mainly hard-boiled, because he's got just a voice for it, I think. How it started, how this came about was I'd asked him to do another story for the channel because the first one he did went down so well. And I suggested A Dinner Date with Murder, which he did, but it was too short. So he offered to do this other one that we've just heard. So here now is A Dinner Date with Murder, written by Harry Stein and narrated by Caspar Stockhausen. Please check out Caspar's other work from the links in the show notes. It was long past the dinner hour, and too early for the after-theater crowd. The two men at the table near the door were the only patrons in Luigi's restaurant. They had eaten, and were sitting there drinking wine. They drank very slowly, and it was plain that they were waiting for somebody, because they weren't talking much, and had the half-bored, half-impatient look of people of nothing to do but wait. At a table near the back of the room, the waiter, who seemed to be the only one on duty, sat smoking a black, twisted cigar and reading a newspaper. One of the men put his wine glass down and lit a cigarette. Even sitting down, he was noticeably shorter than his companion, but he was powerfully built. He had a deep olive complexion and eyes that were black and sparkling. "It looks like your man isn't coming, Dan," he said. "Don't worry about that, Gaddy," Dan said. "He'll turn up. He knows the trail's hot, and he'd rather be a live rat than a dead kidnapper." Gaddy shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he said vaguely. "You say you'll know if it's the same one that phoned. How can you be sure?" "The accent. It's unmistakable. A deep voice and an accent like a vaudeville dialectician's." Gaddy refilled their glasses from the green bottle on the table, and then they were silent. The front door opened, and two men entered. One was fat, with a complexion the color of old weather-beaten brick, and eyes that were watery and cold. He wore a high-crowned, pearl-gray fedora, set squarely on his head, and his fleecy coat had heavily padded shoulders. The other man was slight and sallow. His coat was too tight across his back, and he walked with a defiant swagger. They hung their hats and coats on the rack, and sat down 2 tables away from the one at which Dan and Gaddy were sitting. The waiter put down his cigar and came to their table, bowing slightly. "Spaghetti with a meat sauce," the stout man ordered loudly, "and a bottle of Chianti." "Same," the small man said laconically. The waiter went off without a word, and the 2 men lit cigarettes. Dan and Gaddy watched them with open curiosity, waiting for some sign, but they smoked in silence, never looking in the direction of the other table. "It's the organ grinder accent, all right," Gaddy said in a barely audible voice. "But where's the high sign?" "Give him a chance," Dan mumbled. "He has to be plenty careful, I suppose." The waiter came in with a wicker-wrapped bottle, which he set on the table before the newcomers. Then he went back to the kitchen, and when he returned he brought 2 heaping plates of spaghetti, dripping reddish-brown sauce and giving off a fragrant steam. "The idea is to talk on a full stomach, I suppose," Gaddy whispered. "Or isn't he the guy? I thought your man was coming alone." "He didn't say," Dan said. Gaddy watched the fat, red-faced man wielding fork and knife, eating the spaghetti with great relish. "That's a pretty good spaghetti, eh, Joe?" the fat man said loudly. "Right," Joe replied briefly. Dan looked towards the back of the room, where the waiter was again occupied with the cigar and paper. Maybe they're waiting for the waiter to clear out first, he was thinking. He sipped at his wine, waiting. And then he looked up again. The stout man had almost finished what was on his plate and was taking a long drink from his wine glass. He put the glass down and sat back in his chair. He turned his watery eyes on Dan and nodded his head slowly up and down, up and down. Dan glanced quickly at Gaddy, who had his elbow on the table, seemed to be sleepily leaning far over to one side of his chair. Then he nodded his head at the stout man, just as the latter had done. The next instant, he was on the floor, and somewhere over his head, repeated claps of thunder were bursting, as if they would never cease. And from the other table he heard a choked scream. His ears hurt in the silence that followed. When he rose from the floor, Gaddy, gun in hand, was already standing at the side of the 2 men who, a little while before, had been enjoying their spaghetti, and were now dead. The waiter had disappeared. Dan took a revolver from the lifeless hand of the small, sallow-faced man. He looked at the chambers. All the cartridges were neatly in place. He never had a chance to use it, Gaddy explained. The door opened again. A man with his hat drawn down low over his eyes stood in the doorway and looked wildly about at the dead men and at Dan and Gaddy. Then he turned around frantically. "Our man!" Gaddy cried. He leaped forward, grabbed the fleeing man by the elbow and jerked him violently into the room. "You wanted to see us," Gaddy said. "You found the lieutenant, didn't you?" Every feature of the man's face was distorted with terror. Gaddy shook him. "This is Lieutenant," he said, pointing to Dan. "What were you going to tell him?" The man was looking at the corpses with a slow, steady gaze. His face was more composed now. "Sure," he said in a deep, resonant voice. "They are dead now, yes? I no have to be afraid, yes?" "That's right, they're dead," Dan said. "Where have they been keeping the kid?" The man drew a piece of paper from his pocket. Dan read the address on it and put it in his own pocket. "Who are they?" he asked, pointing to the bodies. The man was calm now. "That's Rocky Callahan," he said. "And the little one, he's a Joe Baker. I was going to tell you. I was going to, how you say, walk out on them. Rocky Callahan from Detroit. Dan said in surprise. You mean the fat fella? That's all right. Heh, sucker, Gaddy chuckled. Yeah, Dan said wryly. But what started the target practice? He pulled a rod on us. Gaddy said. Who? Joe Baker, the little guy. I didn't see it. Sure, 'cause you weren't looking for it. I was looking at them. Baker had it under the table in the hand he wasn't eating with. You couldn't notice unless you bent down to look under the flap of their tablecloth. They must have found out their pal here was going to sing. I figured he probably told us too much already. And they counted on getting him later. Dan nodded reflectively. But what I want to know, he said, is how you happen to be looking under their table. Gaddy chuckled some more. Was just making sure, he said. Guys named Callahan shouldn't try to eat spaghetti. It might have palmed off the accent, but nobody with a real accent like that would cut up his spaghetti with a knife and pick up tiny pieces on his fork. What's wrong with that? Dan wanted to know. Gaddy gave him a look of contempt. You eat spaghetti with a fork and a tablespoon to help you wind it around the fork. And you eat it full length or it isn't worth eating. You're damn right. Gaddy's prisoner put in belligerently. His fear and humility were completely gone now. That's the only way to eat him. So both of those stories, Candidate for a Coffin, by T.W. Ford, and A Dinner Date with Murder by Harry Stein, both narrated by Caspar Stockhausen, were from the January 1942 edition of the pulp magazine The Hooded Detective. Well, actually, Hooded Detective, not the. And I think I said a candidate for the coffin, and in fact it's just Candidate for a Coffin, so they hate their articles in this, either definitely or indefinite, they just don't like them. Anyway, T.W. Ford, whose full name was Thomas William Ford, was, and not much is known about him, was a prolific writer. He doesn't have a Wikipedia entry, could you believe? Where am I going to find my info? I had to scour the internet. Was a prolific writer during the golden age of pulp fiction, born in the early 20th century. They believe Ford's career spanned several decades, with his most active period occurring between the 30s and 30s and 50s. He wrote extensively across various genres, including westerns, and in fact, I think that he's best known for the westerns. Detective stories, sports yarns, contributing hundreds of stories to numerous pulp magazines. Despite his significant output, the internet tells us Ford's work was often noted for its inconsistency, oscillating between moments of brilliant prose and less polished passages within the same story. I thought this was a pretty good story. The first one, yeah, looking at the clock it's so noir, hard-boiled, wasn't it? I loved it. On the platform, just the language, the wisecracking. We know noir, we've done a bit of noir now, so we know what it's like, where we like it still. One of Ford's most enduring contributions to pulp fiction was the creation of the Silver Kid, also known as Solo Stratton. He was a gunfighter in westerns. This character, a drifting heroic gunfighter distinguished by silver-adorned attire, became a staple in western pulp magazines. Ford wrote over 60 Silver Kid stories between 1935 and 1950, primarily published in Wild West Weekly before moving to other magazines like Real Western, Double Action Western, Western Action, and Complete Cowboy. That's me. Although Ford also worked as an editor in the pulp industry, he remains a relatively obscure figure today. As we know, partly due to the inconsistent quality of his work and his limited output of novels, because he mainly churned out these stories which are very forgettable. One of the good things about them that the writers liked was, you didn't have to wait, you didn't have to go through a 2-year publishing process with all the publishers and all in gatekeeping and wait for your money and all that. They paid you. You wrote the story, they accepted it, they paid you. If this magazine didn't pay you, then Black Mask would pay you, or Complete Cowboy would pay you. I would like to get my stories in Complete Cowboy. There wouldn't be westerns that just pimp out. Anyway, never mind. You can get lost, can't you, sometimes? There was somebody complained that I go back on myself, that I contradict myself, that I repeat myself, and go, yeah, welcome to the show. So, Hooded Detective, this magazine that these two were published in, was a short-lived but memorable pulp publication that debuted, how you say that, debuted a debutante in September 1941 and ran for 3 issues, only 3, with its final issue published in January 1942, this one. It was published by Louis Silberkleit's company, which also, or Silberkleit, if it was German, it'd be Silberkleit, which also, Silberkleit, probably, which also produced a variety of other pulp and comic book titles. The magazine was notable for featuring the adventures of the Black Hood, a vigilante crime fighter, who quickly became a popular character. This guy was created by G.T. Fleming Roberts under the pseudonym of G.T. Fleming Roberts. It's not much of a pseudo, though, is it? The Black Hood stories combined elements of superhero action and gritty detective fiction. In fact, if you look at the Hooded, the Masked Detective, there is a guy called the Masked Detective, which was confusing me when I was doing my research, and he is a superhero detective. These things are growing at the same time, of course. The heyday of pulp magazines spanned from the 1920s through to the 1950s, with titles such as, these are detective titles. Black Mask, we did the Western ones before. Dime Detective, Detective Fiction Weekly leading the charge. Black Mask magazine in particular is credited with shaping the hardboiled detective genre, publishing works by legendary authors like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. These writers, along with others like Carol John Daly and Earl Stanley Gardner, we haven't done a story by him, crafted stories that were tough, fast-paced and brimming with sharp dialogue and moral ambiguity. Absolutely the noir hardball genre, isn't it? And a noir and hardball aren't quite the same thing. Noir is really a film genre, but they overlap. The protagonists, often private investigators or rogue cops, not complete cowboys, you understand, navigated a dangerous urban landscape filled with corruption and violence, reflecting the anxieties and challenges of the era and this era. But I wonder what our stories say about us. The decline of pulp detective magazines began in the late 1940s and 50s due to several factors. The rise of paperback novels, which offered more sophisticated and varied storytelling, began to eclipse the pulps because they became cheaper and more widely available. A longer read, people like... do you know there are things called whales who consume... So if you're a science fictioner or a romance whale-off whale, you are capable of devouring enormous quantities of this stuff. And there are readers who do that. So the paperback provides more meat for them, if you see what I'm saying. So... and the advent of television provided new forms of entertainment, and the radio as well, that drew, although the radio had existed, so maybe not, but drew audiences away from printed fiction. I guess you can listen to the radio and do other things. You have to read and look at it, and you have to watch TV. You have to sit down and look at it, really. So that's probably why they are in the greatest competition with each other. I recently narrated part of Varney the Vampire on the Casa Ghost Stories podcast, and that came out of the Penny Dreadful. And it struck me as I was reading about the pulps, how they were a similar movement, the Penny Dreadful movement in Britain a century earlier. But they are a comparison in terms of their gross popularity and eventual decline. Both forms of literature played pivotal roles in shaping the popular fiction landscape of their respective eras, though they emerge in different cultural and historical context. Penny Dreadfuls began in the early 19th century and gained immense popularity by the mid-1800s, named for their cost, a penny per issue, and their sensational, often lurid content. These stories primarily targeted young working-class readers who had limited access to more expensive literature. Books were expensive, even the blue books were expensive. They were a kind of a cheap version of the subscription libraries, and if you couldn't afford that, and of course this was a time when ordinary working people were becoming literate, and so they wanted to read things. And it strikes me that there's a similarity in tone between the Penny Dreadful and the pulp. They are lurid. They are full of shocking and I won't say peep show, if you know what I mean. I don't necessarily mean that in a kind of sexual sense, but I mean that kind of lurid-looking, rubbernecking, wanting to see extreme things, hyperbole and things like that. Sensationalism is the word. So, because the Penny Dreadfuls have Sweeney Todd, Varney the Vampire, and these characters become household names, as I guess the Silver Kid may have a century later. So, the sensationalism focus on violence, mystery, and stark moral dichotomies, the affordability and episodic nature of Penny Dreadfuls made them highly accessible, fostering a culture of reading among the lower classes, as it says here, and often serving as an introduction to regular reading habits. In contrast, pulp detective magazines gained prominence in the early 20th century, peaking between the 1920s and 1950s, so almost a century apart. They were named for the chief pulp paper on which they were printed and targeted at a broad audience, including working-class and middle-class readers, with their affordable price and thrilling content. You see, they're the same thing, really. The stories in pulp magazines were characterized by hardball detectives, femme fatale and gritty urban settings, often exploring themes of crime, corruption, and moral ambiguity. Famous titles included Black Mask and Dime Detective. We know this, featuring iconic characters like Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe. Like Penny Dreadfuls, pulp magazines were widely accessible and provided affordable entertainment options during economically challenging times, such as the Great Depression and World War II rather. They also played a crucial role in shaping the modern detective genre and influenced other forms like the radio, television, and film. You could argue that the Penny Dreadfuls shaped the modern vampire genre. Modern horror genre. Similarly, the decline of pulp detective magazines started in the 40s and 50s and 1940s and 50s. Several factors contributed to this, including the rise of paperback novels. We've already said this. So, what was the decline in the Penny Dreadfuls, really? Again, yeah, the better quality stuff becoming available at a cheaper price, These were, and very interesting thing, we have about T.W. Ford and how there's not much known about him, and he churned out hundreds of stories. This is exactly like James Malcolm Rymer, who is one of the authors of Varney the Vampire. Probably had a number of authors, like the Silver Kid. I think I may be wrong, but I think other people wrote Silver Kid stories. And, it was James Malcolm Rymer wrote Varney, but it was also thought maybe Thomas Peckett Prest wrote it as well. So the authors, they were not artists, and they didn't consider themselves artists, and neither did pulp, even though some of their work rises to artistry, I think. But they were professional writers, and that's what they did for a living, and they churned out the stuff that they knew their public wanted to read. Maybe Hollywood could take a chance on that, actually, churn out something. I always think that when they're making these movies and they're investing like millions, billions of dollars in them, at some point, and then they come out and they get 18 on Rotten Tomatoes. Through that process, I say, doesn't somebody sit down and go, do you know what, I think this might be crap? Not necessarily worthless, but just the story's badly written. There's no story to it.